understand this. All right. So as Smitty said, I work for NOAA. NOAA, most people know NOAA through the National Weather Service. It's under the Department of Commerce, but within NOAA is an organization called the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. And the easiest way to think about us is we are sort of the equivalent of the National Park Service underwater. We manage now 15 places around the world that are designated as national marine sanctuaries. In fact, 2 weeks ago, the newest one came on board. The map isn't even updated, at Mallows Bay in the Potomac River. But all of these sites fall under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, which was established in 1972. And they were designated because of their biodiversity, their archaeological resources, their aesthetic beauty, their recreational value. And for folks here in this room, the closest, of course, is the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. But all of them began on a little spot off the coast of North Carolina, which was the location of the sinking of the Monitor. So going back to, and then this is actually the site that I manage. The shipwreck of the Monitor, all of you remember from your high school history, the Monitor and the Merrimack, was a Civil War ironclad built in Brooklyn, New York in the summer, or fall rather, of 1861, launched in January of 1862, and is famous for one battle on March 9th, 1862 at Hampton Roads, Virginia, between the Confederate steamship, the Merrimack, which actually was known as the CSS Virginia at the time. And for about 4 hours, these two ships battled it out at Hampton Roads to a draw. But the world and the history of naval history would forever be changed, because this signaled the end of the wooden warship and the beginning of the iron warship. And I don't want to go too much into this because Smitty's already said that I get to come back if I do a decent job tonight. I'll talk more about the Monitor. But that ship, as I said, born in the January of 1862, was lost that same year while under tow off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, with 16 of her officers and crew having been lost. And her location was not known for about 111 years. And then in 1973, a team from Duke University went out to look for the Monitor. Now, you can all hear me okay, I assume? Okay. They found the ship, announced it in 1974, and the question was, what do you do to protect this shipwreck that's sitting in 235 feet of water at the time, actually on the high seas? It was not in U.S. territorial waters. And scuba was just becoming into its own in the early 70s. But there was concern about how do you protect this important resource. And so the governor of North Carolina asked NOAA if the Sanctuaries Act, which had not yet been put to use, could be used. And so on January 30th, 1975, it became the first national marine sanctuary in the country. It protects one shipwreck, which is the wreck of the USS Monitor. And through the 70s and 80s, NOAA did a lot of research work at the site, and then the decision was made that it was important to do some selective recovery on the shipwreck, and the decision was made to recover key pieces: the ship's engine, its turret, and with that came about 3,500 individual artifacts. The turret was raised in August of 2002, and if you go to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, all of this is on display either in treatment or in exhibition galleries. But this project, and again I'll talk more about it hopefully in the future, is probably another 15 to 20 years away from being completed. But the purpose of it is about preserving the stories and the history of this shipwreck. There's a full-scale mock-up of the Monitor there at the Mariners Museum, and it is probably one of the premier maritime museums in the country, closing in on 100 years old. Again, if you've never been there, I strongly encourage you to do it. This is the conservation lab where these artifacts are being treated. It's about 60,000 square feet, all dedicated to the Monitor and her artifacts. But we are asked often why, and I think I half jokingly told Smitty that I'm looking for about $16 million more to finish this project. In the end, it'll probably be about a $20 million conservation effort. And people ask, why is that important? And the answer is, in a way, seen in this image. This is a photograph taken in July of 1862 on the deck of USS Monitor. Lincoln had just left the ship. He'd come down to visit it. And this picture is one of my favorites because it captures a lot of things in here. And what it captures to me is that in a snapshot photograph, you see in this everything the Civil War was about. You see in this image, there are, and in the preceding images, I'll show you African Americans, Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Americans that had lived here for generations at that time, immigrants that had just come from Europe, all working together to preserve the Union, struggling with issues that even today, to some extent, we still fight for. And the story of the Monitor, not just from a scientific and a technological perspective, or from a naval historian's perspective, but from a social perspective, is one that's too important to lose. And so our job at the Monitor Sanctuary is not only to care for the site off the coast of North Carolina, which still remains a grave site, and to look after the artifacts being conserved, but to make sure that the story of this ship and what she did, how she changed history, is not lost. And so to that end, these artifacts are being preserved so that thousands of years from now, they will still be around long after, at least I'm gone. Most of you will be around, I'm sure, longer than I will, but this story is not lost. These images are actually pretty cool. There were a series of 8 stereoscopic images taken that day. The photographer had actually come down with the intent of photographing Lincoln, but was late. And so instead he took pictures for crew. When we recovered the Monitor, inside the turret were, as I said, thousands of artifacts, everything from gun casing to silver, silver utensils, and all sorts of other things. There was also the remains of 2 United States sailors that were recovered. Because the Monitor was no longer a U.S. naval ship, but the remains were U.S. naval personnel, the military took those remains, and for about a decade they were in, of all places, Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii at a facility called JPAC, which is a facility that the Department of Defense established primarily to identify Southeast Asian, Korean War, Vietnam era losses when they were found. But they've worked cases from the War of 1812, the Civil War, and of course took the Monitor sailors in. But after a decade, they had not made an identification. They had got good DNA from both of these individuals. We knew their height, we knew their weight, and a lot of things about it. We knew that they had artifacts associated, like this wedding ring. And so in 2012, we worked with Louisiana State University to do facial reconstructions of the 2 sailors that were recovered, with the intent of trying to get, as I've said before, shake some family trees, get people to look in their attics and in their albums and see if there was anybody that would come forward that may have had these 2 gentlemen in their family history. And unfortunately, they didn't. We got more people that did come forward, but there weren't matches. And we learned more about these 2 men, but were unable to identify them. And so NOAA worked with the Secretary of the Navy, and in March of 2013, on the 151st anniversary of the loss of USS Monitor, these 2 men were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery on a very, very cold day. And there were about 10,000 people that came out to see these 2 men buried at Arlington. And although we don't know their names, it is clear, though, that they, as a person personally who served in the Navy, it was very moving to know that the promise that we make our servicemen and women, whether it was service a few weeks ago in Afghanistan or during the Civil War 150 plus years ago, the commitment to bring you home and to do everything the nation can remains. And so these people, of those 10,000 folks that were there that day, there were about 144 who were descendants of the Monitor crew. They were folks that knew that their ancestor had survived. They knew that their ancestor in some cases had not survived, but it wasn't these men. But it really didn't matter. To them, this was about family, and it was about carrying on that tradition and keeping that story of the sacrifice of the Monitor sailors alive. And today, if you go to Arlington Cemetery, near the mast of the USS Maine, you'll see this marker where the names of all 16 men are memorialized, and that's where they rest today. So I bring this up to sort of set the stage for what I came here to talk to you about, which is German U-boats, which may not seem like a natural connection, but trust me, it will. For 40 years, NOAA has been in the business of protecting this story, this shipwreck. Those are photographs of the Monitor today sitting on the seabed, and assuring that these stories are preserved. But as we've done that, we've become keenly aware of other stories that are just as important to the national story that somehow over the course of decades has sort of been lost. Our nation has a unique and proud heritage of memorializing and commemorating and honoring those places that are part of our national story. Places in many times of conflict and war, places like Antietam, that previous image was Yorktown, places like Shiloh, Custer Battlefield in Montana, and of course more recent places like the Pearl Harbor Memorial and the resting place of USS Arizona. We do this because it's our connection to the past, to previous generations, and it is the mechanism with which we hand to our next generation the stories that make the fabric of the United States. These stories, when you get into stories like Shiloh and the Monitor, the time has come where there's no living connection to them, but when it comes to World War II, there still is a living connection. And so it makes those places associated with the Second World War even more important. As we've been working, this is a map of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. As we've been working on the Monitor for the last 40 years, we have become aware, and it has been well known, as one of the best wreck diving locations in the country, for a couple of reasons. One is that the continental shelf comes in very close to Cape Hatteras. And so it became a key hunting ground for the German U-boats because they could hunt in those shallow waters above the continental shelf and then quickly get out into the deep water to protect themselves. It also was the main shipping route between Norfolk and Charleston and Miami and other places during the war. And so these losses that were the result of the Second World War are sort of concentrated in this area. People have known it, they've dove those sites, but unfortunately, and I can't give you an answer for this, but I am asked it often, nobody stepped up and said, hey, what are we going to do about this to honor these? They were just sort of taken advantage of, not taken advantage of, in some cases I guess they were, but the fact that this rich history was sitting there was sort of ignored. In a Washington Post article about 2 years ago, 2/3 of American millennials, and this is not an attack on millennials, trust me, were surveyed in a recent poll that could not identify what Auschwitz was. And again, not a damning statement on the ignorance of younger generations, but it is certainly a testament to the fact that we live in a busy time with cell phones and need 24-hour news cycles and history that's happening around the clock, and it becomes tougher and tougher to keep ourselves connected to the past. So as we've worked with the Monitor and we've looked at these shipwrecks, we have come to, during a series of surveys, we've noted that there are 78 merchant ships, 8 Allied naval ships, and 4 German U-boats just off the coast of North Carolina alone. Most of those sunk in 1942, some of them within weeks of the attack at Pearl Harbor and Germany's declaration of war on the United States. And of those, nearly 1,700 of those men, of 1,200 of them were U.S. Merchant Marine. Does anybody in this room have family members or anyone here Merchant Marine? Well, for those who are not familiar with it, it is the civilian service that is responsible for shipping the goods and basically the tools of our economy around the country. The Merchant Marine today is not what it was back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but it also has, beyond just an economic role in terms of moving gas and supplies, it also becomes an auxiliary of the United States Navy during time of war. So the U.S. Merchant Marine and the men, and I use that term loosely because oftentimes these men were 15 and 16-year-old boys that were on these freighters getting supplies around the world, were called to service, drafted into the war effort, and were put in harm's way with the highest casualty rate of any branch of the service, higher than the Marine Corps, the Pacific, higher than the Army Air Corps. 1 in 26 merchant mariners would not come home. But because they were civilians, they were treated very differently when they got back. If your ship was torpedoed out from under you, you were lost, you were killed, you were a POW, your contract was over, there was no pension, and your family member received nothing for it. In many cases, at the end of the war, the Merchant Marine were onto their own to try to get back home. The United States would not carry them back because they had worked for a company. And I could go on and on about the sacrifice of the Merchant Marine, but suffice to say, they died and they served right next to their uniformed counterparts, the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Navy Armed Guard, in the exact same way, but came back and did not receive veterans benefits until 1988. At which point most of those men were in their 70s and 80s, and they received partial veterans benefits. They received the right to the GI Bill, in case any of them wanted to go back to college. And they received the VA loan, in case any of them were interested in buying a brand new house at 80 years of age. But that was basically it. And these men, now numbered, estimated to be down to about 3,500 men, continue to fight for recognition, and quite frankly, as I have heard said to me many times, a simple thank you. And so, looking at the number of shipwrecks off North Carolina, the Merchant Marine's story became very clear. And it also became very clear that our country owes these men, and all the men who fought during the Second World War, a better thank you than we have given them. Ships like this, and I hate to call you out, Dale, but you're too important to this story. A gentleman, a good friend of mine, Dale Revels, is here. His grandfather was the captain on this vessel, a vessel called the Dixie Arrow, Captain Anders Johansson. The Dixie Arrow sits at about 110 feet off North Carolina. It was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dale, one of his last trips before he would enter service in the United States Navy in the war, merchant mariner captain. The ship was sunk in a valiant effort to save the crew. He turned the ship so that the flames would not reach the stern, allowing a number of the crew to get off, but dooming himself and others in the pilot house to their death. And this ship was sunk. And it is important to us because we came to know this is the Dixie Arrow today, part of it covered with sand tiger sharks. It's a natural reef. But it came to our attention as we were surveying these wrecks because of an article about Dale's mom, actually, who was Captain Johansson's daughter. And it was a story about how she recalls becoming homeless almost overnight upon notice of their father's loss, that she wasn't to talk about it, the stigma of not having a father during the Second World War, growing up in the 50s, and eventually growing up having this fine gentleman as a son, but ending up in a restaurant on the Outer Banks of North Carolina and seeing a porthole decorating one of the restaurants from the Dixie Arrow, and recognizing that that was not just a porthole, but it was basically part of her father's gravesite. And that article got our attention, and we were honored to take her out, and I don't know how old she was at the time. 85. We took her about 40 miles offshore with Dale and other family members, and were able to lay a wreath at the site of the Dixie Arrow, provide a little closure, but it speaks to that connection and that the passing of time and how these shipwrecks still are important. Another shipwreck, this is a vessel called the Cohasset. It was a trawler that was immediately pressed into service at the start of the Second World War to patrol up and down the minefield that had been placed around Cape Hatteras. It was a Naval Reserve crew, about 26 men, and it was lost to a boat called the German U-boat U-701. Today it rests at the bottom about 335 feet of depth. This is a detailed photo mosaic of the shipwreck today. It's important because it typifies the type of ships that were put into the war effort on the Atlantic side. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, all the good stuff went to the Pacific, anything that had any teeth to it. And what was left on the Atlantic side was converted yachts, fishing trawlers, World War I, 4-stack destroyers, anything the Navy and the military could put out there. And the story of this ship is equally tragic to the Dixie Arrow. The captain of this ship had been requesting a firing pin for the main deck gun for weeks. It had no sonar equipment. It did have 6 depth charges, and it was put out to patrol this minefield. The German U-701 had seen it night after night and concerned that it would give away the U-boat's position, surfaced and gave his crew deck gun practice to sink this ship. And although the U-71 or the YP-389, which is what this ship was redesignated in the Navy, the crew had some small caliber machine guns they tried to fight. The ship went down, and with 11 of her crew, including one gentleman from Montana. And when he was lost, front page of the Great Falls Tribune newspaper wrote about his passing. His wife traveled to Washington to try to give his pension, unlike the Merchant Marine, to the Pentagon to build more ships, and she was politely sent home and told to buy war bonds. But the impact in Great Falls, Montana for this one family was huge. When this ship, we found this vessel in 2010 near the Monitor, about a mile away from the wreck of USS Monitor. It again ran on the front page of the Great Falls Tribune, which was a nice reminder of our connectedness through our maritime past, even after 75 years. Churchill wrote that the only thing that ever frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. As I mentioned, in Japan, but the first U-boats had already been moved across the Atlantic. And by early January of 1942, the first U-boat losses off North Carolina were already happening, really with nothing to stop them. These boats carried roughly about 45 men. The conditions in them were pretty rough, but they were extremely effective. The convoy system wouldn't really come into play for another year or two on the U.S. East Coast. And of course, the goal was to stop all the shipping that was coming from the United States to fuel the war effort. Fuel, supplies, munitions, all of that material of war was coming up with oil from the Gulf of Mexico around the Florida Straits, up the U.S. East Coast, picking up materials in Norfolk and Boston, and then heading off for the big leap across the North Atlantic. And what was, I've got to be honest, was interesting to me, having been involved with this project for the last 11 years, is if you told me about the Battle of the Atlantic, I would have pictured U-boats fighting off the coast of Ireland in the far up North Atlantic. But the notion that these vessels were operating within a mile of the land, that they were getting into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and sinking ships, was startling. And we have found no shortage of people that recall living on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, being woken up at 3 in the morning to the entire house shaking and the glow of burning ships off the beach, to finding the terrible carnage of war, bodies and material on the shores the next morning, all along the U.S. East Coast. And America was so, I don't know if ignorant's not quite the right word, but so cavalier about these attacks that the Germans joked about how it was like shooting fish in a shooting gallery. They could sit off of New York and off of places on the East Coast and watch the merchant ships silhouetted by all the lights of the cities, because nobody would believe that the threat was real, and they wouldn't shut off the lights. And the Germans referred to this as the American theater of war, and referred to the period in 1942 as the first happy time, because it was so easy for them to be sinking these ships. This is a short, you might need to use the mouse on it. I won't have any audio, but this is a little short video clip. If you move the mouse down, actually, let me just try to get that. And if it doesn't work, it's okay. But it's a little short video of the discovery of the U-576, one of the 4 U-boats off North Carolina. There we go. That would sound, I guess. So this was in 2016. 3 German U-boats, their location had been known off North Carolina, the 352, 701, and the U-85, but a 4th one had never been found. It was a U-boat that had trouble with its ballast system and was heading home to get it fixed because they couldn't stay submerged. And then they thought they had it fixed, turned back towards the shore, and came across a convoy called KS-520. It was bound from Norfolk to Key West, heading down with supplies. He let loose his entire volley of torpedoes, but because of the loss of weight in the bow, immediately popped up right in the middle of the convoy, and not to be polite, but all of hell broke loose. They had aircraft that were bombarding him, and this ship was hit immediately and went down within seconds, with its propellers spinning, all of the crew on board, and its location then was lost. And when we found it in starting survey work in 2014 and then found in 2016, you can see it's in remarkable condition. One of the things that makes it really interesting is that it's sitting about 200 yards away from one of the ships that sank, the SS Bluefields. Although there were no casualties on the Bluefields, they sit as sort of silent testament to the terror of war. And this U-boat sits on the bottom upright with its bow planes tilted up as if she was trying to get to the surface, and again serves as a tomb for the German sailors on board. Interestingly enough, upon discovery of this German U-boat, the German government came forward and reminded the United States that they had asked respectfully on 5 previous occasions related to the other U-boats to protect them from looting. In the case of the 352, 701, and 85, they are popular dive sites, again in North Carolina, and every time one was discovered, within weeks, the conning tower was breached, antennas were cut off, hatches were pulled out. In the case of the U-352, this goes back into the early 70s, skeletons were pulled out and put in dive shops, and regardless of what side of the war you were fighting, these men still represent war dead. Just in the same way that the U.S. war dead in New Guinea and in other places, we would not want those bodies messed with. The Germans reminded us that they consider these war graves as well and asked the United States what could be done to protect them. So all these different pieces, the story of Mrs. Revels and the story of our work at the Monitor, has sort of led to this. What we have concluded is that in the same way that Gettysburg and Shiloh and these other places are a landscape that properly should be preserved, we're recognizing now that the waters off North Carolina are also a battlefield. In fact, they really truly represent the only U.S. battlefield from the Second World War, if you think about it. The attack at Pearl Harbor was a single attack at a time when Hawaii was a territory. There was in the Aleutians, which were a territory at the same time, but there was no population up there. They were attacked by the Japanese. But the only place where the war really came to the doorsteps of the United States was through the Battle of the Atlantic and along the U.S. East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. And where it is best represented is off Cape Hatteras. So our office has been working for literally, don't ever let it be said that the government moves swiftly, because we